June 25, 1876. A hot, dusty valley near the Little Bighorn River in Montana. Colonel George Custer, fresh off Civil War fame, sizes up 7,000 native warriors with only 600 soldiers behind him. He smirks and says, "We've caught them napping, boys." Hours later, he's dead. 2 bullets tearing through his chest and skull. His entire battalion wiped out. This isn't a movie. It's history's brutal reality. The U.S. Army lost 280 men that day, outgunned by Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho fighters, who hit back with repeating rifles and raw fury. How did a decorated commander collapse so fast? And why did Sitting Bull's victory vision come true? Right down to the warning his warriors ignored. Stick around, because this story's got twists you won't believe. The Battle of the Little Bighorn kicked off on June 25, 1876, near the Little Bighorn River in Montana. The Lakota and other Plains tribes called it the Battle of the Greasy Grass, but most folks know it as Custer's last stand. It pitted a huge coalition of Lakota Sioux, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors against the U.S. Army's 7th Cavalry Regiment, led by Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer. And guess what? The natives crushed it. They took down Custer and his men in a way that left the army stunned. This battle stands out as the biggest moment in the Great Sioux War of 1876, a real turning point that showed the world these tribes weren't backing down without a fight. So how did it all go down? First off, this wasn't some random brawl. It was years in the making, rooted deep in the clash over the Great Plains. That whole region was the last big holdout for Native Americans in the U.S. Before the Civil War, settlers had swarmed the far west, but the Plains? Too dry, too tough, and way too full of native tribes for most folks to bother with. Then the war ended, and things flipped fast. Land out west started running low, and the U.S. government set its sights on the Plains. They rolled out railroads, offered cheap land deals to settlers, and basically said, "This is ours now." For the tribes living there, like the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, that was a hard no. They'd already seen what happened elsewhere. By the late 1860s, most native groups across the country were either dead or shoved onto reservations. The Plains tribes decided they weren't going out like that. They dug in, ready for a long, nasty fight to keep their way of life. Enter George Custer. This guy wasn't new to war. He'd fought for the Union in the Civil War and showed up on the Plains in 1866, right when tensions with the tribes were boiling over. He'd already led a successful attack on a Cheyenne village, proving he could hit hard. But he knew this wasn't like battling Confederate soldiers. These native fighters were fast on horseback and knew every hill, river, and valley like the back of their hands. That made them a whole different beast. Then came the Black Hills Mess. Back in 1868, the U.S. signed a treaty saying South Dakota's Black Hills belonged to the Great Sioux Reservation. Sacred ground for the Sioux, no question. But in 1874, Custer led an army expedition there and found gold. Suddenly, the U.S. wanted to buy it. The Sioux wouldn't sell, not a chance. A year earlier, in 1873, Custer had his first run-in with Lakota leaders, Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, during a railroad survey at Yellowstone. That clash was just a taste of what was coming. So who were the big players in this battle? On one side, you've got Custer and his 7th Cavalry. Over 600 soldiers, armed with Springfield single-shot carbines and Colt .45 revolvers. Custer was bold, maybe too bold, with a reputation for charging in guns blazing. On the other side, Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse led a native force that was unreal. We're talking 6,000 to 7,000 people total, camped along the Little Bighorn River by March or April of 1876. About a third of them, around 2,000, were men or boys ready to fight. This wasn't just one tribe. You had Cheyenne up north, Sioux down south, with the Hunkpapas at the southern tip. In between, along the river's twists, were the Sanark, Brule, Minneconjou, Santee, and Oglala, plus 5 Arapaho warriors in the mix. They brought serious firepower too: Winchester, Henry, and Spencer, repeating rifles, plus bows, arrows, and tomahawks. Sitting Bull wasn't just a warrior. He was a Lakota medicine man with a spiritual edge. Before the battle, he held a Sundance ritual, painting himself yellow, cutting flesh from his arms, and dancing for 2 straight days. He got a vision: victory was coming, but only if his people didn't loot the dead soldiers. That warning mattered, and we'll see why later. This battle wasn't just a fight over land. It was a collision of worlds, and it shook America to its core. The natives pulled off something huge here, and Custer's name would never be forgotten, for better or worse. The buildup. Why did this battle happen? Let's break down what led to the Battle of the Little Bighorn on June 25, 1876. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment fight. It took years of pressure to get here. Start with the Great Plains. Before the Civil War ended, in 1865, this was the last big spot Native Americans held onto in the U.S. Why? The land's dry, hard to farm, and full of tribes like the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, who outnumbered settlers. Back then, folks had already claimed the far west, places like California, but the plains stayed tough to crack. After the war, that changed quick. Land out west got scarce, and by the late 1860s, the U.S. government wanted the plains bad. They started building railroads, like the Northern Pacific, and offered settlers cheap deals to move in. By 1870, railroad tracks were cutting through native hunting grounds, and settlers were pouring in. For the tribes, that was a direct threat. The government didn't stop there. They went after the buffalo. Those herds, millions strong in the early 1860s, were everything to the plains tribes: food, clothing, shelter. The U.S. figured if they killed off the buffalo, they'd kill off native resistance too. So they let hunters go wild, pushing them to slaughter as many as possible to clear paths for railroads. By the mid-1870s, buffalo numbers dropped hard, from millions to just thousands. The more hunters stacked up bones, the angrier the tribes got. Some didn't just stew on it. They fought back. They hit hunters, settlers, and railroad workers with no mercy, no matter who they were. Men, women, kids, didn't matter. It was chaos. By the late 1860s, most Native Americans nationwide were either dead or forced onto reservations. Think hundreds of thousands, reduced to a few scattered groups by 1870. The Plains tribes weren't having it. They decided to hold their ground, whatever it took. Now meet George Custer. He rolled into the Plains in 1866, straight out of the Civil War, where he'd fought for the Union. He wasn't some rookie. He'd already led a brutal attack on a Cheyenne village in 1868, burning it down and proving he could win. But he saw right away, this wasn't like fighting Confederate soldiers. Those battles were orderly, predictable. Here, the natives rode fast, struck quick, and knew the land better than anyone. Custer clocked that and knew he had a real challenge. He kept at it anyway, because that's how he rolled. Then the Black Hills came into play. In 1868, the U.S. signed a treaty with the Sioux, locking South Dakota's Black Hills into the Great Sioux Reservation. It was sacred to them, untouchable. Fast forward to 1874, and Custer's leading an army expedition there. They found gold, big time. Word spread, and by 1875, prospectors were sneaking in despite the treaty. The U.S. tried to buy it, sent offers, pushed hard. The Sioux said no way. That land wasn't up for grabs. A year earlier, in 1873, Custer ran into Lakota leaders, Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, during a Northern Pacific Railroad survey near Yellowstone. The Lakota attacked his crew, and he fought them off. But it wasn't easy. Those two weren't just fighters. They were sharp, fearless, and ready for more. That scrap showed Custer what he was up against. Things hit a boiling point in early 1876. The U.S. told the tribes to move to reservations by January 31, or be labeled hostile. That order came down in December 1875, giving them barely a month. The natives didn't budge. Instead, they headed to Montana, joining Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. By March or April 1876, their camp swelled to 6,000 or 7,000 people along the Little Bighorn River. That's straight from an Oglala Sioux warrior named Heater, who saw it. The U.S. wasn't messing around anymore, and neither were the tribes. That's what set the stage for June 25. Here's who fought in the Battle of the Little Bighorn on June 25, 1876. On one side, you've got George Armstrong Custer and his 7th Cavalry Regiment. He had over 600 soldiers, all carrying Springfield single-shot carbines and Colt .45 revolvers. Those guns weren't cutting edge. Each shot had to be loaded by hand. Custer didn't sweat it. He'd been at this since 1866, coming off the Civil War with the Union, and he'd scored a win in 1868 by hitting a Cheyenne village hard. That boosted his confidence, maybe too much. By June 1876, he was leading this unit as part of a bigger army push. General Alfred Terry and Colonel John Gibbon commanded 2 other columns, but Custer took point. His job was clear: round up the natives and force them back to reservations by January 31, 1876, or mark them hostile. That order came down in late 1875, and he was still chasing it 6 months later when the battle hit. On the other side, you've got Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. Sitting Bull was a Lakota Sioux medicine man, not some kid running into fights. He was seasoned, respected, and held the group together with more than just weapons. Crazy Horse was the spark. Young, fierce, and a born warrior, he could ride and fight like nobody else. Together, they ran a coalition of 6,000 to 7,000 people, camped along the Little Bighorn River by March or April 1876. An Oglala Sioux warrior named Heater saw it and said it was the biggest camp he'd ever seen. Out of that, about 2,000 were men or boys ready to fight, roughly a third of the total. This wasn't one tribe. The Cheyenne held the north end. The Sioux took the south, with the Hunkpapas at the bottom. Between them, along the river's curves, were the Sanark, Brule, Minneconjou, Santee, and Oglala. 5 Arapaho warriors joined too. Their gear? Winchester, Henry, and Spencer repeating rifles, plus bows, arrows, and tomahawks. Those rifles could fire multiple rounds without reloading, a huge edge over Custer's single shots. Sitting Bull didn't just lead, he saw the future. Before the battle, around March or April 1876, he held a Sundance ritual. This was no light ceremony. It was a sacred Lakota tradition. Men only. He painted himself yellow to call on the sun's power, then cut flesh from his arms until blood poured. After that, he danced for 2 full days, his men right there with him. On day 2, he dropped, and a vision came. He said they'd win, hands down, but only if nobody took stuff from the dead soldiers. If they did, the Lakota would pay a heavy price. He'd had visions before, and they'd all panned out. His people trusted him. When he shared this one, their spirits soared. They weren't just pumped, they felt unbeatable. Crazy Horse didn't lean on visions. He was all about the fight. Back in 1873, he'd clashed with Custer during a Northern Pacific Railroad survey near Yellowstone. The Lakota hit hard, and Custer pushed back, but it left a mark. By 1876, Crazy Horse was a name soldiers feared. He led warriors from across the tribes, keeping them sharp and ready. The camp was a beast. Natives from as far as the Missouri River had joined up, drawn by word that soldiers were coming. That's why they stayed tight. 6 or 7 camps stretched along the river. The Cheyenne sat north, the Hunkpapas south, and the rest filled in. By June 25, 1876, Custer's scouts, including Crow and Arakawa, working for the army, spotted this setup at midday. It was huge, bigger than anything they'd seen, per Heater's count of 6,000 to 7,000. Custer still thought he could roll in and win. That's the lineup. 600 soldiers with slow guns against 2,000 warriors with better rifles and thousands more behind them, led by Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. It was set for a brutal clash. The Battle of the Little Bighorn happened on June 25, 1876, near the Little Bighorn River in Montana. It started back in January that year. The U.S. government gave Custer orders in December 1875 to move all natives in the area to reservations by January 31, 1876, or they'd be called hostile. The deadline passed, and the natives didn't go. Instead, they left their reservations and headed to Montana, joining Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. By March or April, their camp along the Little Bighorn River hit 6,000 to 7,000 people. An Oglala Sioux warrior named Heater said it was the biggest gathering he'd ever seen. They weren't there to negotiate. They were gearing up for a stand. Jump to mid-June 1876. The Army brought in 3 columns, around 1,200 soldiers total, led by General Alfred Terry, Colonel John Gibbon, and Custer. They met up around June 15 to plan. Crow and Arapaho scouts, working for the Army, found a native trail leading to Little Bighorn Valley. Terry and Gibbon told Custer to move in, surround the camp, and hold tight for reinforcements. But on June 25, around midday, Custer's scouts spotted Sitting Bull's camp. He didn't wait. He pushed his 600-plus men forward, even shot a few natives on the approach, thinking he'd catch them sleeping. He was wrong. Custer split his force quick. He left a small group, about 50 or 60, with the supply train to watch the gear. Major Marcus Reno took around 100 men west to hit the camp's south side. Captain Frederick Benteen got about 120 and swung southwest to check for other native groups that might flank them. Custer grabbed 210 and went north. Reno struck first, around noon. The natives scrambled at first, but then Hedog and Braveheart rallied, circling a hill behind Reno's crew with rifles and bows. Crazy Horse charged in, with more warriors, boosting their momentum. Reno's men got pinned from 2 sides, took heavy fire, and lost at least 30 soldiers fast. They retreated uphill to what's now Reno Hill, natives right on their tail. Custer kept moving north. He saw the Cheyenne part of the camp, mostly women and kids, and split his 210 again. 2 companies, around 80 men, went west toward the river to ease up on Reno. Custer took the other 130 north, looking for a crossing spot. It backfired. Benteen heard the shots, looped back, and joined Reno on the hill with about 300 total now, forming a circular defense. Crazy Horse peeled off to guard the camp's center, expecting another hit. He was spot on. A Lakota group under White Thunder swung east, firing from the tall grass. More natives rushed up from the south. Custer's men were boxed in before they knew it. The fight turned brutal. Custer tried a defensive line while eyeing the river, but the natives smashed through with repeating rifles and arrows. His first line broke. He fell back to high ground, sent men to block another angle, but that line crumbled too, losing dozens. Crazy Horse tightened the circle, hitting one side while others closed in. Custer's guys ditched their horses, using them as cover. It didn't help. The natives overwhelmed them. All 210 with Custer died, including him with 2 bullets, one near his heart, one in his head. Reno's officers at Weir Point saw it from afar, natives swarming a hill, finishing off the wounded with shots to the ground. Reno and Benteen held Reno Hill, around 300 strong by then. The natives kept up the pressure, trading fire all day into June 26. Terry's reinforcements, hundreds more, rolled in that morning. The natives saw the odds shift. They'd lost about 160 fighters total per later counts, but the Army took a bigger hit, around 280 dead, mostly Custer's crew. With Terry there, the natives broke camp and pulled out by June 26, ending the battle. It was the U.S. Army's worst loss in the Plains Wars, up to that point. So what happened after the dust settled on June 25, 1876? The Battle of the Little Bighorn was over by June 26, and the numbers tell a stark story. The U.S. Army lost about 280 soldiers. Custer's group took the worst of it. All 210 men who rode with him north were dead, wiped out in that final stand. The natives hit him hard, and he didn't walk away. 2 bullets got him, one near his heart, one in his head. Reno and Benteen's crews on Reno Hill lost around 70 more, bringing the total to 280. That's a rough count from reports after the fight. The natives? They lost about 160 fighters, maybe a bit more or less, based on what folks pieced together later. Either way, it was a bloodbath. For the Army, this was no small loss. It was the biggest beating they'd ever taken in the Plains Wars, hands down. They didn't see it coming, and it stung. But the aftermath wasn't just about body counts. Things got messy right after. Sitting Bull had that vision during his Sundance ritual back in March or April. He saw the win coming, said they'd take down the soldiers. But he gave a clear warning. Don't touch anything on the dead. No looting. No trophies. He said if they did, big trouble would follow the Lakota. Guess what? Some didn't listen. After Custer's men went down, warriors swarmed the hill where he fell. Reno's officers at Weir Point, a lookout spot nearby, watched it happen. They saw natives moving over the bodies, not just finishing off the wounded with shots to the ground, but grabbing stuff. Rifles, clothes, whatever they could carry. Sitting Bull's words didn't stick, and that choice lingered. It wasn't immediate, but the Lakota and their allies would feel the heat later. This victory didn't last long, and breaking that rule might have been a bad sign. The native camp itself was something else. It wasn't just big, it was massive. Heater, that Oglala Sioux warrior, said it was the largest he'd ever seen. 6,000 to 7,000 people stretched along the Little Bighorn River. 6 or 7 camps tied together, tight and organized. You had Cheyenne up north, Hunkpapas down south, and Sinark, Brule, Minneconjou, Santee, and Oglala filling the gaps, plus those 5 Arapaho warriors. The officers at Weir Point agreed. They'd never seen so many natives in one place, moving like a single unit. It wasn't permanent, though. That unity held for the battle, pulled off a win nobody expected, but it didn't stick. After Terry's reinforcements rolled in on June 26, with hundreds more soldiers, the natives saw the writing on the wall. They packed up fast and split, heading off in different directions. That camp broke apart as quick as it came together. For the U.S., this was a wake-up call. Losing 280 men, especially Custer's whole battalion, lit a fire under the Army. They didn't shrug it off. By July 1876, word spread fast. Newspapers back east screamed about Custer's last stand, and the government doubled down. They sent more troops west, thousands over the next year. By 1877, the Great Sioux War kicked into overdrive. The natives won big on June 25, sure, but it painted a target on their backs. The Army hunted them harder, broke up their camps, and forced more onto reservations. Sitting Bull took some Lakota north to Canada by 1877, dodging the heat. Crazy Horse kept fighting, but got cornered and killed that same year. The victory was real, cost the Army 280 lives to their 160, but it didn't stop what was coming. The U.S. cracked down, and the Plains tribes paid for it. This battle meant more than just a fight. It showed what the natives could do when they teamed up. 6,000 to 7,000 people, 2,000 warriors, beating back over 600 soldiers. But it also showed the limits. They couldn't hold that power long. The Army's loss on June 25, 1876, was huge, biggest in the Plains Wars up to then. But the natives' win faded quick. By 1877, the tide turned, and the U.S. was back in control. It was a moment of triumph that slipped away fast. It was the U.S. Army against 6,000 to 7,000 Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho fighting for their land. Custer's 600 soldiers lost 280, including his 210-man battalion, to the natives' 160 dead. Biggest army loss in the Plains Wars. It showed their power, but by 1877, the U.S. crushed that win. Lesson? Custer's fall proves you don't mess with a force you don't get. Was he a hero or a cocky leader who got 280 killed? Tell us below. Like and subscribe for more history like this.